Christianity, which began its march across the planet in the 1st century AD, was rigidly and inexorably changing the reality around it. The Church wanted to dominate not only people's minds, but also their bodies. The freedom of manners that had been accepted earlier became taboo and was punished very severely. The Church dictated to the laity in what positions they should make love. Any position other than missionary was considered sinful and forbidden by the Church. However, to please the nobility and the rich were allowed 4 more positions, which were arranged in order of increasing sinfulness. Missionary, on the side, sitting, standing, behind. So let's talk about that today. Friends, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and put a like. Such innovations, as mentioned above, were introduced to please the nobility and the rich, as they were often obese, and it was not possible to make love to their wives in the God-pleasing missionary position. The Church could not deprive the sufferers of the possibility of procreation and went along with them. During the Middle Ages, oral and anal caresses, as well as masturbation, were forbidden and were not allowed under any circumstances, as they did not lead to conception, and thus to the birth of children, which according to the priests should have been the only possible reason for coitus between a man and a woman. Violators were severely punished. Prostitution in the Middle Ages was widespread everywhere. For example, even in small villages worked representatives of this ancient profession, who could not work incognito. They could be beaten, mutilated, accused of fornication, and even killed. The situation was different in cities, where prostitutes offered their services anonymously, without revealing their real names. Prostitutes could work on the street, where the client could be any passerby. Others, more privileged toilers, showed their skills of sex in brothels. In the Middle Ages, prostitution was not condemned, because according to the priests, only commodity money relations could keep society from sexual collapse, adultery, and sodomy. Needless to say, most of the brothels in medieval Europe were in the church department, probably to control the observance of moral principles in them. In addition, the church received good profits from the work of brothels, so they were in no hurry to close them. In general, sexual prohibitions, rules, and regulations permeate not only the Middle Ages, but the entire history of mankind. Scientists, thinkers, priests, and legislators, including those of the Middle Ages, wrote mountains of works to explain to mortals how, when, with whom, and for what purpose one should have sex. Anything that interfered with the natural conception of a child, namely contraception, was never approved by the Church. In those days, the Church was busy catching sodomists, collecting denunciations and complaints to make a fair judgment in matters of male-female relations and executions. Therefore, contraception was considered a minor offense rather than a sin. In medieval Europe, various rules and laws were introduced to control the private lives of ordinary people. Church officials were deeply convinced that all girls should take the example of the Virgin Mary, and not only keep their chastity for the only man, but also with him to behave modestly and discreetly. Any deviations from the ascribed rules developed by the clergy were considered a grave vice, fornication, and were punished up to the death penalty. The interest of the Church in the intimate life of the laity was so great that at the organized trials they thoroughly, down to every detail, inquired into the details of those who sinned and recorded what was said in the church books. The term missionary posture remains from those times. It was the only option the Church legalized for husband-wife relationships. The other way was forbidden. Other ways were considered devilish temptation and were severely punished by physical punishment or death. The woman was considered the guilty party, for she alone could force a man to break the law. The rules for women were that she had no right to be undressed in bed with her husband. She was not allowed to move or make any sound. If the rules were broken, a woman could be accused of witchcraft and demonic association. Even her husband could complain against her. In this case, she was universally despised and had to repent in a monastery for the rest of her life. For a married woman, adultery on the side was not allowed. The overriding feeling was not the jealousy of the spouse, but the fear that the offspring would turn out not to be their own, but to have been fathered on the side. Men of that time often went on military campaigns and did not think of anything better than to design a fidelity belt, which resembled a torture mechanism. Initially, the main function of fidelity belts was to make it more difficult for brigands to rape a woman while traveling. Over time, the nobility used fidelity belts for wives while they were away on military campaigns or traveling. The metal structure was put on the woman, and a specially trained person was invited to do this. The belt was locked with a key, which was taken away by the husband. If suddenly it turned out that the woman was pregnant, the belt was removed by the blacksmith, and witnesses and representatives of the church were present at this action. The servants of the god contemplated the secret places of the woman and saw nothing vicious in it. There were only two paths a woman could take in the Middle Ages. She could remain chaste. To do this, she had to become a nun, the bride of Christ, and spend her life in a convent. Or she could marry, bear many children, be faithful to her husband, and be a homemaker. Close relationships in the family were regulated clearly by day. Religious holidays and fasts, as well as Thursdays, Fridays, and Sundays, were days when relationships were under a serious ban. To violate them was to commit a grave sin. Spouses also owed each other sex. If they did not, a church court could be convened at any time. A legal order to have sex was no more complicated than an order to pay unpaid debts. The marital duty to have sex went so far that Pope Alexander II declared in the 12th century that a wife was obliged to have sex, even if her husband had leprosy. Whether this would have actually been universally applicable is something we'll leave aside. After all, the Pope is not your neighbor and can't actually come to your aid in the event of a default. However, all of this applies to the opposite side as well. Women could also force their husbands to have sex in court. This also applied if the wife was ill or even if they did not share a household together. When in doubt, the church court obliged the husband to visit his wife once a week at her father's house for conjugal intercourse. If a husband failed in bed with his own wife, but worked miraculously with his mistress, it was undoubtedly due to witchcraft. Time and again, men accused women of bewitching them to steal their masculinity. However, contrary to popular belief, this did not lead to witch burnings, which was more of a fad of the early modern era. Belief in magic, on the other hand, was real and widespread. Strict church rules had exceptions for the wealthy nobility. For example, a peasant about to marry was obliged to inform his master, the owner of lands and estates. The feudal lord had the right of the first night and was the first to have relations with the bride. The common people could not oppose this. The law was approved by the church, and it was not in the power of the peasants to overturn it. Perhaps Sigmund Freud would have been out of work if the Christian church with its canons of piety had not existed in the Middle Ages. We are the inheritors of those very mays and may-nots. In the Middle Ages, sex was called fornication. Adultery was punishable by death, excommunication, and other anathemas. The most curious about the intimate side of life were judges and punishers, priests, monks, and theologians. They have left us detailed testimonies about how they loved in the Middle Ages, how they had sex, and continued the family. From first date to first intimacy, in detail, and with drawings. The basic rule of courts and love was, look, but don't dare touch. The church forbade openly demonstrating sexual interest, but allowed that love and admiration could have something in common with sex. Courtois love is commonly understood as a relationship between a knight and a beautiful lady. People have made love at all times, but intimacy for pleasure has been practiced not so long ago. Earlier, sex was a way of continuation. No one really thought about the fact that it can get a lot of pleasure. And only with the advent of contraceptives, it became clear that mankind wants to be able to have sex for pleasure without thinking about undesirable consequences. And today we have access to so many different techniques, types, and practices of intimacy that simply the eyes run wild. What is worth the assortment of toys for adults? All we have to do is try, enjoy, and push the boundaries of pleasure.